Once again, welcome back. Today we're talking about modulation. I'm going to try to keep this brief since the last lecture was so long. We're going to start out by revisiting this golden mean rectangle that we looked at last time and the use of it in composition. I'm going to take this rectangle and remove the spiral so we can just look at the shapes and the modulation of size from larger to small in proportion to the format itself of 1 to 1.618. I'm going to rotate it, and then I'm going to repeat that breakdown in all four corners. I'm going to use this as a grid to lay on top of this painting by Leonardo da Vinci. This is the Virgin of the Rocks. Here. And we're going to find this pen tool, and we're going to look at a few things about the way that Leonardo is using the 5x8 or golden mean rectangle to compose his painting. So you'll notice here, the head of Christ lies directly on this proportion break, and the eyes move through here, and the front of the face moves through there on that line. You'll see that Mary is situated here, and that Leonardo has given us a line here and a line here along this format break. Her hand here lies on this powerful proportional break. Here with the angel that is supporting, I think that's supposed to be St. John, that the angel's arm lies on top of this proportion break, that the head of John here is bisected by this proportion break. Christ rests here on this proportion break. You'll see even in the background in all of these landscape elements that these things too align with the 5x8 sections. That this rock moves along this proportion axis. This sort of stuff is happening so often and all over the place that it's not coincident that these things line up the way that they do. That this finger rests precisely on this proportion break again. These things are all incredibly intentional on the part of Leonardo. If I use this grid and I take a diagonal of one of these sections, let's say this central section, and move from here to here, then I'll see that the shawl that Mary is wearing aligns with that diagonal thrust, that her lap here rests on this 5x8 section break. The more that you look at this, the more it becomes apparent of the ways in which Leonardo is using the power of the format itself and the hidden geometry within it to compose his composition. What I'm trying to say is that I'm not making this stuff up, and that you can use a grid like this yourself to help break down works of art. It would be a great benefit for you to actually do this, and we will actually do this later on in the semester. But that's just a quick revisit of this idea of the use of proportions in composition. All right, so let's move on to modulation. Modulation is a measured change It can be a measured change in position. We've looked at this painting before, the parable of the blind leading the blind. And here we have an example of a change in position, a measured change that moves from upright to down if we take a look at this sort of diagram of the painting here. Here's a different sort of modulation. This is a modulation in size. You can see the 4 trees that move from the left to the center of the painting in this, The Hunters in the Snow by Peter Bruegel the Elder. A measured change in the size of the trees that gives us a clear indication of space moving into the picture plane. So you have modulation in position, you can have modulation in size. Here's another example of modulation in size. This is a sculpture by Richard Serra. You can see the size of it by the image of the person walking around the interior of it. Also, along the bottom, I have given you all of the information in terms of the measurements of the different slabs of steel to show the very intentional change in size. They go from 11 feet to 9 feet to 7 feet. So that's a change in 2 feet from slab to slab. And you can see moving from the left, coming towards the viewer here, the change goes from largest to middle to smallest to middle to largest again. So a different sort of modulation in size. Here's another example of modulation in size, but it's also a modulation in position. This is a sculpture by Andy Goldsworthy. I'm sorry that I don't have more information in terms of the name or anything. There's a really interesting documentary, it's easy to find, about Andy Goldsworthy that you might be interested in looking up. I think I saw it on Amazon Prime pretty recently. This guy goes out into nature and takes ephemeral elements of nature, like these sheets of ice or leaves or different rocks, and creates a sculpture. He takes a photo of the sculpture, and that's a documentation of the work, but the work, that's not the work itself. It is a record of the work, this photograph that we're looking at. And the work is the sculpture itself, but the sculpture is meant to disappear. This ice will obviously melt in time. These rocks that he's broken will be pushed around by wind and water and different forms of erosion. So these sculptures are not meant to last. That's an element that he's using in the work. But here we have another modulation in size from large to small, and a modulation in position that moves around in this spiral shape. And here's another one where we have a modulation in density as we move towards the center of this sculpture. And you'll actually notice that this is an arch and not a complete circle. It's an arch on a lake, and so it is the mirror image reflected on the water that creates this image of the circle. But there's a modulation from very dense towards the center into very sparse towards the edges of it. Here's another example of modulation in position. This is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase #2, in which he's repeating shapes over and over again, but changing their position as they move from top left to bottom right. This creates, in this instance, a sense of movement. Here's another painting. This one's by Charles Demuth. I saw the figure 5 in gold, and there's a very clear modulation in size with a unity of position, slightly off-center positionality for the whole thing, but the change in the size of the number 5 is a constant rate in change. But this example of another constant rate in change, this is the Pizhi Pagoda in China. And you can see as it moves up in stories, but it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So these changes in size can be made even more powerful if they use proportion, the power of proportion that we discussed in the last lecture. If this rate of change is constant in terms of a proportion from one to the next is the same relation as the next to the following, then the modulation becomes even more powerful. Here's an example of modulation with a unity in shape. This is a painting by Josef Albers, whose work you've seen before. We looked at a lot of his prints. The unity in shape with the square format, the square shapes inside the square, modulation in the size of the square. This creates very strong unity, and so Albers is using this essentially as a way to have to stop thinking about size. Or to stop thinking about shape and size and position. He's got all that laid out in a it's nearly symmetrical, but it's not. It's enough off of being symmetrical to keep it interesting. But all of these things are creating a strong unity, and he has hundreds of these paintings, all with the same pattern, all with the same size, shape, and position of these squares, but he's using different colors. So for Albers in these paintings, his main interest is color. So what he's doing is he's actually using the size, shape, and position to create a strong unity that then he doesn't have to worry about anymore, and he can just focus solely on the color. You guys, we're not dealing with color yet in design 1. You'll get to that in design 2. But here is a use of modulation as a means of creating unity. This one is difficult to look at. It hurts my eyes just looking at it now. This is Fall by Bridget Riley. She's a artist, optical. And you can see that this is a unity of shape, right, with these long curving lines. But then there's a modulation in the positionality of the curves, so that there's sort of this wave function being created, very tight and close waves at the bottom to very slow waves, longer waves towards the top. And it looks like it's moving. It's definitely not. Yeah, it hurts. So modulation of this sort to create this intense optical effect. I don't know if any of you guys listen to Tool, but this guy creates a lot of the album art for the band. I'm not going to say that this is good art, but it's an example of modulation. It's an example of modulation of size and shape and position all at once, taken to an extreme. So just taking this idea of modulation and pushing it really as far as it will go. So there you go, Alex Gray. All right, so Mondrian, and this is the composition with red, blue, and yellow from 1929. You'll see that Mondrian is very limited in his in his vocabulary. He's limiting himself to vertical and horizontal lines only. Those lines can vary in terms of width, and so their weight varies. And he's limiting himself to the primary colors and black and white. So he's creating a very serious set of delimitations for himself. And in this, he's trying to create something powerful in terms of its visual quality. So let me pull my pen back out real quick. This is a square. It's 23.4 inches by 23.4 inches. And Mondrian is going to break this down in terms of fourths. So that this line represents a division of 1 below to 3 above, or 1 below to 4 in terms of the whole. Similarly here, this line represents a division of 1 to the left and 4 to the right. This section again represents an area of 1 to an area of 4, an area of 1 to an area of 4, or an area of 1 to an area of 4, an area of 1 over here to an area of 4 here. So the entire composition is built on quarters. This is appropriate in terms of the format itself, square being 1 to 1, defined mainly by its 4 sides. Here's a painting by James McNeill Whistler called Arrangement in Gray and Black No. 1. First, I'm going to lay a 1 to 1.618 golden mean rectangle along the left-hand side of this painting. So I'm cutting off a golden mean section, and you'll see that the line of this is actually a painting of McNeill's or of Whistler's mother. So that the handkerchief that she's holding lies along the golden mean axis there. And the painting on the wall is actually in the shape of a golden mean rectangle and lies along the axis of the golden mean itself. I'm going to take this away and throw up a golden mean from the top, and you'll see that it captures Whistler's mother's face, along with the position of her hands there. So even in a format that isn't a golden mean, the artist is using the proportions of the golden mean to compose the image. But we're talking about modulation here. So I'm going to cut a square off the right side of this painting, and then I'm going to lay down the diagonal of that square, and we can see that the subject matter of the painting, the mother here, lies along the diagonal axis. And I'm going to start breaking down the image in the way that Whistler is composing it. The second largest square here, I'm going to take that away for a second. You can see the line of the shadow on the floor and the drapery on the wall creates this square. The black line on the wall is going to give us our second or our third largest square here. And then we'll find another square where the sitter's hands meet the diagonal like this, so that the composition itself is created through a modulation of size of the square that is shaved off the right-hand side of the painting. Pull my pen out one more time, and you can see this painting, which we said is a golden mean rectangle, is bisected at this point at the proportional break of the 5x8 golden mean rectangle. It is bisected by the square that is created from the black trim on the wall and where that meets the diagonal here. This is, again, this is the use of the hidden geometry of the picture plane, but it's also an economy of means. Whistler is using at least 2 golden mean rectangles to help him compose this image. He's modulating in size. He's using that modulation to divide or to help him place this painting, which is a golden mean rectangle. The placement of it determined by the positionality of the modulation. As I say this, I know that it all sounds totally nutso, but this is how the geometry is used to create timeless composition. There is no place for any of the elements in the painting to move to. There's no desire for the shapes to move in any direction. Everything has its perfectly found place through the geometry. This is what timelessness is in a work of art. Nothing can move because everything has been found to be perfect in its location. So modulate. Modulate in size, modulate in position, modulate in shape. You can change from stated geometry, very harsh angles, to softer angles, to softer angles, to softer shapes, like this. So you can modulate in size, shape, and position. But if you modulate from the picture plane itself, from the position of the picture plane, from the proportions of the picture plane, from the size and shape of the picture plane, then you're going to have an even more powerful image. So let's take a look at your homework. Studio problem number 10. Using narrow dark lines in a root 2 format, that's the 5x7, that's the 1 to 1.4, create a unity of shape with a modulation of size from the format. So modulate the size of the shape in accordance with the proportion of the format. If the format, this root 2, has a proportion of 1 to 1.4 or 5 to 7, then modulate the size so that each size smaller than the next has a relation of 5, an area of 5, to an area of 7, the next smallest, an area of 5, to the previous 5's 7. Give me 10 thumbnails and 10 variations. If you have any questions, email me. Also, if you guys want to earn some extra credit, you can go to the Visiting Artists series for fall 2020 for the American University Studio Art Program. Queer Threads. Go check it out. It is available at american.edu/cas/studio. This is where I earned my MFA from. There's a series of visiting artist lectures. They're all dealing with textile arts. I think it's going to be mainly Thursday evenings at 6 o'clock. If you got the time, visit it, take a screenshot of it, send it to me. You'll get a little bit of extra credits for engaging in the art world. Thank you.